actually the second time I've done this lecture, and for me, we've been doing lectures about FAF for a couple of years now, at over 20 universities, which is kind of wild to think about. And this was felt like a really big step for us, because it was the first time that I think we had taken our sort of organizing, our fairly sort of like responsive grassroots work, and we contextualized it within a much sort of broader analytical framework. So that being said, the first time we did it, it was absolutely massive, and I think we've got what, like, is it 20 minutes today?
Half an hour.
Half an hour?
Ish.
Okay, half an hour-ish. So I'm gonna, actually, I'll tell you what, I'm just to keep myself accountable, I'm gonna give myself a timer, because otherwise I don't want to keep you guys here all night. There we go, brilliant. So yeah, I'm gonna try and get that down into half an hour. So if you haven't heard of FAF or Future Architects Front before, it started out during lockdown, and if you know it at all, you probably know it in one of these two formats, either an Instagram page or a Twitter page. And this is because we started out as graduates in lockdown, and we had virtually no access to any kind of platform or institutional leverage to kind of channel our frustrations with the state of architecture and more broadly the state of the UK and the world more generally. So we decided to try and leverage social media, which obviously through lockdown underwent something of a mass legitimizing, because all of a sudden you had to be on social media, but so did your university, so did suddenly everything was online. So when we started to build this thing, suddenly it was on slightly more of a level playing field than it otherwise would have been even 5 years ago. So the way that it started to connect with people was that initially I think it acted as a bit of a sort of confession. So you could send a direct message to FAF, and then you could have your experience shared anonymously, and then you would see that experience echoed by dozens and dozens and dozens of people who had all been through similar experiences of exploitation in architectural practice. And we kind of took all of this, we conducted a survey, and we created an open letter to the Royal Institute of British Architects based on all of this input that we had been given. This was signed by over 1,800 people, was considering the fact that we didn't have any official position or power at this point, it was an incredible turnout, and we did meet with RIBA, and they promised to address some of the key points we raised, like unpaid overtime, lack of accountability for architectural assistant positions, lack of climate action, these kinds of things. And then, probably unsurprisingly, not much happened, so we decided about a year later, all right then, let's try and run our own campaign and run our own election process, which was between us, the union, UVW SAW, Architects Climate Action Network, previous people who had worked and volunteered at RIBA, and that led to the recent president's election, which initially Moira ran on a sort of platform on a hustings that we hosted with a few other people. He won that, and then we went on to support him for the proper RIBA election, which he won again. And then we also conducted a similar sort of process with education, surveying people about what they would like to see change in architectural education, and through a series of consultations, so on and so on, we were able to also contribute to sort of similarly what felt at the time like a fairly monumental moment of reform. It is looking like it might be kind of rolled back a little bit now, but still something that at the time was quite, I guess, overwhelming from the position of no power that we started from. So that is really all I'm gonna say about us, because I think if you want to know more about us, the Instagram page is there, the Twitter's there, there are podcasts about it, and I think you can find that all if you really care about it. What I am much more interested in using this kind of time and these sort of spaces to talk about is framing of where sort of architecture is currently, that I think is foundational to how architectural workers, and in particular young architectural workers, position themselves both as people and as practitioners. So one thing that I think is really important to understand, both in contextualizing our experiences generally, but also in contextualizing the work that we've done, is how did things get so bad? How did things get to this point where people are working like 60+ hour work weeks, and wages have stagnated for years and years and years on end? Well, the sort of easy answer, I suppose, would be something to do with these guys, or a process otherwise known as neoliberalism. So, to sort of get it across simply, neoliberalism is the belief that the sort of free market is a better way of supplying human need, social need, than a planned economy or public services can do. So you can see that around the period of Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, you get a massive dip in public corporations, you start to get increased power of central government, you start to get decreased power of local government, decreased funding of local government. You can see this is particularly accelerated around the period of Osborne, Cameron, and austerity. And what this means, what this shift away from the welfare state, the state as a kind of active funder of human social need, what this means for architects is that we go from a state of the profession in 1976, where 49% of all UK architects work for the public sector, to fast forward to 2017, that's gone from 49% to less than 1%. So the profession of architecture has effectively, through the process of neoliberalism, become privatized. And this is not something that just affects architects, of course. So you can see across this same sort of time period that similarly, another aspect of neoliberalism is to try and militantly reduce the bargaining power of unions and workers. And again, across this same sort of process, you can see sort of severe drop in union membership, and almost as if these two things are related, a kind of correlating increase in income inequality. So while a lot of the time I think it's easy for us to think of this as like an architecture problem or something's happening to architects, it's very, very much something that's happening across the board in almost every way. You can also see another troubling kind of development in the connection between productivity and remuneration. So productivity in this sense is literally just how much work are you able to do in any given amount of time, right? So if we contextualize this in architecture, let's say you're going from drafting to AutoCAD to Revit to Midjourney, I don't know, and each of these technological advancements means that you're able to do more work in the same amount of time. You would assume that someone doing more work in the same amount of time would see a parallel increase in remuneration for that labor. But what this chart shows us is that when we look at adjusted median earnings, that these two figures have become decoupled over time. So even though we're working more and we're producing more with every year that passes, we are not seeing the fruit of that productivity as workers. That value is going somewhere else. And to connect all the dots, the value is going up to employers, it's going to owners of capital. So why, if we are in this position, is it so rare to hear any kind of sort of political action from architects? Why do we even need a lecture series called Anti-Apathetic Architecture? Well, the reason why you need to resist apathy in architecture is because historically, architects have been part of what's called sometimes the professional managerial class, the labor aristocracy, and basically what this means is it just means you are part of the working classes that have certain conditions that lead to a more comfortable lifestyle. So you have a higher significance of like scale and regularity of pay, you have prospects of social security, you have more secure conditions of work, you have more amicable relationships with the sort of social strata above and below you, you have improved general conditions of living, and you have prospects of either individual or collective advancement through your work. Think about the small practice where you think, oh, I'll be running this place one day. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Yeah, I think this is mirrored when we look at data on sort of like privilege in so-called elite occupations in the UK. And we think of barristers, judges, journalists, doctors, we think of these as being quite privileged professions, but what you see is that if you actually map all of this out, architecture and town planning comes out right at the top if you define privilege as having one or more parent from a managerial background. So I think what we can see from this information is that the reason why you have apathy in architecture is primarily because historically architects have been comfortable. They've not been rolling in it, they're not absolutely, well, some of them are, but most of them are not millionaires, but they are sufficiently sheltered from the kind of harshest conditions of the wider working class that you do not see much solidarity, you do not see much labor organizing from architects historically. That is all kind of changing, which is, for those of us in the room right now, not a great thing, but also could be a good thing in the end. But things are changing now because of a few reasons, but one of the big ones being intergenerational inequality. So people of our age are far more disadvantaged than previous generations, primarily because so much of wealth in the UK is tied to home ownership. And you can see how, as generations progress, the age that people get onto the housing ladder or start to own these assets that wealth is measured by, it becomes longer and longer and longer. And bear in mind, the lowest line here is people born in the 80s. So most of us in this room aren't even on this diagram, and I promise you we're doing worse than people in the 80s. So that is a big distinction of young people in architecture today versus that bigger picture of architects historically. And another example of that is if we look at graduate pay. So this is annual Part 1 salary adjusted for the Consumer Price Index, and you can see that graduates today are being paid less than they were 15 years ago in real terms, right? So, and costs obviously are not going down. So we are in a position right now where you can have a REBA salary guide, which it says it's a guide, but really it's just a benchmarking, it's an average of existing REBA salaries. You can have a REBA sort of salary benchmarking data that shows Part 1's lower quartile, 19,250, when we're in a position now where the minimum wage is £21,673, right? The practice of architecture through this kind of neoliberal competition has been in this race to the bottom for decades, where in order to win work, practices have been undercutting each other in order to secure jobs. Where they are able to undercut each other comes from reducing their costs. One of the easiest costs for them to reduce is the salaries of their most junior employees. The problem now is that there's not anything left to cut. Or if you do, you're going to get an unpleasant call from someone in the government because you're paying someone below minimum wage. So this is what I mean when I talk about the proletarianization of architectural workers, right? We've gone from a fairly comfortable position of the labor aristocracy who are very much getting a fairly comfortable piece of the sort of capitalist pie to shield ourselves from the worst conditions of the working class, but that is no longer the case, especially if you are in your 20s right now, or even if you're in your 30s. So, cool, what do we do about that, right? Like, everything's on fire, everything's kind of shit. I probably didn't even really need to tell you guys that, I'm sure you already knew it. I think one of the most important things in responding to this is understanding why is this? Is it a moral thing? Is your boss a bad, greedy person, or is it something else? Well, to look at the built environment through a sort of like Marxist analysis of capitalist production of the built environment, you start to see that actually this isn't moralistic at all. This is a production process operating exactly as it is designed to. So a great way of like summarizing this kind of like capitalist production can be summed up in this one meme. So we've got this, I'll read it for you because it's quite small. I need to tell me what's wrong. My co-workers and I produce $3 million worth of goods every year. The materials and utilities cost $800,000. The tools cost $200,000, and all of us combined get paid $500,000, which means that there's $1,500,000 being paid to someone who didn't contribute to the work at all. Oh fuck. And remember that decoupling of productivity and wages that we saw earlier, right? This isn't just an abstract thing. You can look at this through history getting more and more exacerbated. So what that means for workers in general, and what that means for architects, is that you have this sort of kind of struggle playing out in what it means to work for a private company today, right? So through a day of work, you're producing two kinds of value. One is necessary value, which is you producing the value that you get paid for, which can sustain your life, right? Your rent, your food, your bills, whatever. Then you do some more work, which produces surplus value, more than what you need to sustain yourself. This surplus value is what means that a practice or any private company can profit. And there is a constant ongoing struggle of how much of your day is necessary value and how much of your day is surplus value. So when your boss says, oh, can you work this weekend? Can you just stay in for an extra hour? What that is that's extending the working day. That's giving more space to create surplus value. Or if they say, okay, we're doing this big update, all the old programs are out and the new programs are in, and we want you to work twice as hard, be more productive. Well, that's reducing the amount of time needed to create necessary value, and again, increasing the portion of the day that is surplus value. So this is the relationship that guides the conflict between the working class and employers, people who don't get paid according to their labor, but get paid according to how much surplus value they can accrue through their business, right? So there's two very, very, very different core motives driving these two sort of buckets of society. And another couple of definitions that I find really useful as well is a distinction between use value and exchange value. So if you are a worker, the odds are most of your life is concerned with considering use value. So I need to pay rent because I need housing, which is C stands for commodity, which is a commodity that I need to stay alive, or something that I enjoy or appreciate. these are things that you can't really put a number on because they have a sort of social value which is to some extent intangible. And so for most people who need to work to stay alive, their day-to-day concerns are CMC, commodity, money, commodity. The first commodity is your labor, which you sell to get paid, which you then spend on another commodity, right? Now, that understanding of the world is flipped entirely around if you're an employer or if you are someone who owns capital, because then suddenly what you're concerned about is how do I purchase a commodity, and then how do I somehow get a return of more money from that commodity? And as we saw with labor, that's a very sort of specific relationship where labor generates surplus value that allows you to get an increase of money back. If you're a merchant, you could buy something for less somewhere else, sell it for more somewhere else. But basically, this is a quantitative relationship. This is something that you can put a number on because money is fundamentally quantitative. So what this means is that if you are an employer, if you are someone who's primarily concerned with the accumulation of capital, this is the relationship that you're interested in. And it doesn't just stop once you do it once, of course, because if that's what you need to sustain yourself, if that's how you accumulate wealth, this process needs to keep going again and again and again and again and again and again. And the reason why I'm kind of getting into the weeds of this with you guys is because I think it's really useful in understanding the core drivers that shape the built environment. I think the relationship between this and our own work lives is fairly clear, like I described with the productivity and the overtime. That's fairly easy to see. But it doesn't just affect how we work, it also affects what we're even allowed to work on. And to try and get that across, I want to talk about what I think are two super popular typologies of architectural work that you can observe in the UK, and especially in London right now. One being the edgy kitchen extension. So this is sort of like the darling of the small practice, right? You get a sort of bougie London townhouse, you get someone who lives there with like, maybe they've just inherited some money, maybe they've got a bit of disposable income, and they can put a sort of nice fancy extension onto their kitchen. The source of this, if we're thinking about it from the point of view of capital, is these guys, the client, often the kind of like gentrifying presence in the neighborhood. But more importantly, the source of it is the sort of exaggeration of inequality in terms of household disposable income in the UK, right? So this is architecture almost in a sort of very classical sense of like architecture as a patronage, where you are able to do your work through the benevolence of a wealthy patron. But at least this is sort of like, to some extent, what is sometimes called real capital, where the relationship between the capital and the labor is still producing a kind of use value, right? Like, remember, use value is something that actually has some qualitative value and use to it. So these, you joke about them, but like generally, from my opinion, they're designed reasonably well. Like the people who pay for them want to live in them and they want to enjoy living in them. So usually they have some use value to them, right? They're not just pure sort of like throwaway luxury. So you can kind of see it as being real capital. Then what I think is far more insidious is this typology, which I would probably summarize as vacuous New London vernacular bullshit. And this type of build, does anyone know what any of these are called, by the way, any of these projects? Can anyone name one of them?
Is bottom corner one 110C?
Do you know who's the architect? They're all AHMN. But what you can see with these kinds of projects is that actually, not all of them, but many of them, years after they're built, are already falling apart, right? They are not built according to an idea of use value, of people living in them and people using them as housing. They are built purely for exchange value. They are built because people know, developers know, that if you build something on this land, you can capture the inflation of land value, and then you can, that becomes the capital that you accrue, right? So it doesn't matter if people live in it or not, because the thing that you're trying to capture isn't the value of the people living there. The thing you're trying to capture is the inflation of land value, and this is much more of what's often called fictitious capital, because labor is not the thing generating the value here. The perception of value is what's generating the value, which is why you get things like housing bubbles and housing crashes, etc., etc. It's because the value, the perceived value of the land has become so radically divorced from the actual labor that goes into the things on top of it. So this might sound like I'm saying there's kind of like these, two pathways where you either operate like an artisan who gets commissioned by a wealthy benefactor, and that's great, and then there's the bad fictitious capital developer. But the truth is that they're both bad. They're both ways of producing and reproducing the built environment which are sort of fundamentally unjust in terms of who gets to benefit and who gets to live and be alive in cities and in places that architects work on. So this is how, if we think of the capitalist production of the built environment, we're not only thinking of our own working conditions, but we're thinking of what are we even allowed to build? What are we even allowed to create? Even if we are, burning ourselves out every night, you could maybe justify it if you were building some social housing or something like that, but you don't even get that silver lining, right? So why then do I call this one towards an end of architecture? Well, it's because not only is there a sort of impossibility of things continuing along the same paths socially. We, like I showed with the minimum wage architectural worker, we are reaching a space where further social extraction is starting to kind of reach bedrock. But even if you don't buy that argument, we also have the second inevitability of an end of architecture as we know it today, which is ecology and climate. So this is probably one of the most important diagrams that I will show you today. And it shows the connection between GDP at a global scale, gross domestic product, carbon emissions, and material extraction. And what you can see is that these figures are coupled, right? So the more we produce, the higher GDP goes up, the more emissions we're producing, and the more material extraction we need to keep that going. There's a little bit of evidence that carbon emissions can be decoupled from GDP growth, but at the moment it really doesn't look like, even if that can happen, it cannot happen within the time frame necessary to avert all of these tipping points, like 1.5 degrees and so on. So we are in a position as well where the fundamental guiding unit of most Western economies, the GDP, gross domestic product, we are racing towards something that is actively leading us to ecological disaster. And again, let's ground this in architecture. Like, let's not abstract this too much. So let's think about some of the most, speaking of material extraction, like why does that matter? Why does it matter if we extract a load of materials? Well, let's look at the most extracted materials on Earth. Number 2 being sand, or specifically construction grade sand. 75% of this construction grade sand goes into concrete production. The rate at which we are extracting this natural resource has led some researchers to predict that we will run out of natural reserves by 2050. So, sorry Talawando, no more concrete. So, something that is invariably leading to climate crisis is also compounding global injustice. And I think this is really important to understand, is that even if we are trying to think of like climate action and climate transition, unless we ground it in that global view, we risk having a transition to renewable energies in the global north, which is premised on the plunder and exploitation of lands and people of the global south. And don't take my word for it, take the word of the people doing it. So many people involved in lithium, cobalt mining are proudly complicit with their lack of democratic accountability and their exploitative nature. So I think this kind of sums up where we are then quite nicely as architects. This is an article by Kevin Rogan called Picking a Fight. And it says, the only alternative to the predatory overconsumption of finite resources is to utterly subordinate the practice of architecture to the betterment of human lives, by force if necessary. Of course, architecture already is dominated by the master of capital, which gives it form, an ethos, a way of acting. I propose this master be usurped by a social force that seeks to devastate the capitalist world in favor of a human one. Architecture, as it stands, has become exceedingly adept at dying. What if we learned to fight? Which brings us nicely onto how to fight. So I think one of the first things that you can do from the position of a student is to maybe do some light reading. So understand how you sit within this context that I've been describing, understand what kind of agency you have, what kind of access to power and leverage points you have. It doesn't have to be scary, it can also be slightly nicer. Also kind of deprogram yourself of the myths that you are exposed to in spaces of architectural education and most creative education. So for this, I really recommend this article by Marissa Courtwright, Deaf to the Calling, A Job in Architecture is Still a Job, where she kind of lays out all the ways that architects are prone to self-exploitation because of this myth of architecture as something that's not just a job, it's a calling. She has a really entertaining part in this article where she shows how this abstraction of architecture as work even goes as deep as what we call our work, right? So we don't call it an architecture business or an architecture company, we call it a practice or an atelier or a studio, which all sound much nicer. And just generally a really great way of dispelling that sort of myth of the abstraction of architectural work to a calling. And then let's say you've got that, you're like, yeah, I get it, architecture is political, it's work, etc., etc. Well, another stumbling point for a lot of people is not realizing that while, yes, all design is political, not all politics is design. So there's a lot of things that you can do as an architect which have important, profound political impact, but there are limits. There are points where, let's say you're an architect who wants to build social housing, you can't design your way there. You have to operate from a political base in order to change the political economic systems to create a situation where social housing is being funded. And again, to kind of bring it back to climate, there is a huge necessity, a survival necessity for people to fight for these things. Even if we just think of it in terms of the division of labor, right now, one job in oil and gas equates to 3 jobs needed in clean energy, which equates to 77 jobs needed in retrofit, and the sort of rehabilitation of an incredibly inefficient and ecologically destructive built environment. So it's not even like there's no role for architects in this. The role is there. What we need to do is be in a position where we can fight for the political, economic conditions to allow this. And how do you do that, not by yourself? Well, I primarily would advise everyone to join the union, UPW SAW. When it comes to achieving huge system-wide changes that aren't through party politics, you can't get much better than unions. Do you like the weekend? Unions. Do you like the 8-hour workday? Unions, right? These are all things that have been accomplished through labor organizing, and the scale of the change that we need, I believe, is only going to come from this type of organizing, and also the type of organizing of activist groups like ACAN as well, so Architects Climate Action Network. So there are support networks, there are people that you can join to do this kind of work. You're not starting by yourself. And let's say you do want to start by yourself. Well, and also you don't have to do it through architecture as well. There is a wealth of organizing and activism that you can be involved in today, as whatever form you want that to take, whether it's phone banking for the union or for ACAN, or whether it's doing this on the street, whatever it is, there is a use and a place for it. And it's never been more urgent, right? Like, the two parties that we have to choose from right now aren't going to do the things that need to happen. Neither of them are talking about climate action at the scales needed. Neither of them are talking about social housing to the scale it's needed. There is very, very, very little hope from either of our main political parties right now. So these are the only mechanisms that we have left to secure these changes within the next critical few years that we have. And yeah, maybe you don't want to do it through a group, maybe you want to do it by yourself. Well, it's as easy as starting a social media page, as we kind of almost accidentally discovered. I've seen a lot of really interesting, innovative organizing through social media and through other platforms. Someone who we spoke to, who was interested in FAF and then started their own project, was a group called the Pay 100, who now have a platform for kind of like sort of radical salary transparency in the profession. That has now additionally inspired a new group in South Africa who's doing the same thing. So there's plenty of ways to kind of like get out and do things with these sorts of tools that we have access to in an increasingly digital landscape. And I think, yeah, all of this kind of call to fight, I think, can be nicely summed up by this quote by Catherine Herron, which says, architects have to work from a political base, and if there isn't one, you have to start it. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really insightful and a lot of important things to talk about that. I was just wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more? We had a bit of a conversation on retrofit reimagining, because I think that's quite interesting to like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the reminder. So if you are interested in how built environment practitioners are already trying to organize towards these ideas of like a just transition and systems change, with my other hat, not my FAF hat, my Civic Square hat, which is the group that actually pays me. Shockingly, this doesn't pay well. Civic Square, we're organizing a festival called Retrofit Reimagined, which is basically, yeah, kind of like bringing together of many different like activists, practitioners, policymakers, so on, who are interested not only in addressing social and ecological crises, but are also interested in shifting the landscape of policy and economics to make that work easier to do. And if that's something that you'd be interested in having a more broad deep dive into, we have 2 dates for that coming up. One in the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, which is on October the 21st and 22nd, and another one which is going to be in Glasgow on November the 11th. If going to these places is prohibitively expensive, send me a direct message on wherever, and I can connect you with the Civic Square Access Fund, which we've created to cover transport, to cover accommodation, things like that. So the support is there if you need it to access this kind of information. And you know, Civic Square are also just like amazing event creators. It's a great time. There's great food. There's great music. You'll enjoy it.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
I want to, so obviously like everything is systemized in terms of like how this culture that has been developed in practice, like in the industry. But obviously it starts with school, like with architecture school, with a kind of system that's been, I wouldn't say innate, but it's kind of like embedded to the way that they teach students in architectural school. And that's kind of like brought up to the practice. And that's inherent. is there a way that we can start this at school rather than just like obviously in the industry? How do you like have any? I mean, I remember last year that there was an alternative kind of like way of teaching in Westminster. There was like a tutor that does that. But is there something that's kind of like a bit more like it approaches a lot more students in terms of thinking about this? Because obviously this is not gonna. I mean, people are always in social media. We would see everything else, but having this conversation in the architecture space, I think is very important. From like even first year of undergrad, is there any kind of like thinking by the RMBA current president about this?
Yeah, so I think in terms of understanding the relationship of like education and practice, there's a lot of conversation around like, you know, which one started it, and I think the only way to really think about it is that education and practice is like, on a Robert Ross, it's like a snake eating its own tail, and that really there's been a historic relationship between the two, which more importantly is contextualized with wider economic conditions, which have, I think, led them down parallel paths of, you know, further exploitation of time and, you know, the sort of unhealthy conditions that we see today. So I don't think that like, I don't think it's a thing where you have to figure out which one to fix first. I think it's like, yes, let's do it everywhere. But when it comes to education more specifically, I think, I don't know, some of there is a lot of like really great initiatives that I see in architecture schools right now, like student events like this list of people is fantastic. Like student activism, I feel like is like really taking off. Demands that universities divest from like oil capital, things like this. I think there's a lot happening, and you know, even, you know, getting back into architecture. Some of the stuff I also teach critical practice at the LSA, and I think some of the stuff that like the LSA is trying to do with like part 4 in terms of like bringing skills to transition into like architect skill sets and student skill sets. I think that kind of thing is really important and a really big responsibility of architectural education to kind of uplift. So I think there are things sort of like in the air. I think institutionally, when it comes to REBA and ARB, the ambition is still way too low, and I think that's largely a result of like, from REBA, their side is like the kind of mouthpiece of primarily heads of practice, and from the ARB, their sort of role as the mouthpiece of like government and their role as regulators. So I think it's very difficult to expect really big ambitions to come from them, but I am encouraged by what faculty and universities have been doing with their own resources and their own power, and I've also been really inspired by what students are doing with their ability to organize where they are as well. So I don't know if that's a really satisfying question, but like, I think the seeds are kind of there, I suppose. Yeah.
Is there any other questions?
I was going to ask about how receptive REBA has been to unionisation, and whether you see there being a positive relationship between REBA and unions, or if you see them as like contradicting organisations.
REBA is what it is voted to be, and I think we've seen with Moyo's election that it's not that hard to vote it to be something else. And I didn't mention it, but I think actually an even bigger achievement than Moyo's election is the recent Just Transition Lobby campaign that we ran, where we got 7 people elected into council as well. So I think because of the structure of REBA, because of how they are sort of constituted, I don't think they can ever operate as a union, but I think they can have common cause with unions. Because if they were to kind of get their heads out of this like business logic of architectural practice, they would see that the only way that you're going to get a economic improvement of conditions for architects is if you reject the sort of competition motive if you reject the race to the bottom. So I think there's a huge amount of like scope to find common cause between RIBA and the union. But I think we're probably a few more election campaigns away from being in the point where we can kind of try and push that through. But I'm optimistic.
There's another question there.
It's quite a big question. It was one that was posed to us in the first year of Undergrad. I'd be interested to see your opinion on it, but considering your background campaigning. And the question was, would an architect make a good prime minister?
Depends on the architect. It's a very boring answer, but yeah, I mean, I think the premise of that question is that there is a archetypal architect, which I personally kind of reject as a premise, because an archetypal architect depends on predetermined sort of stasis, right? Like you don't get an archetypal architect if conditions are constantly evolving and changing. You only get that if you exist in a kind of vacuum. So I don't personally believe in like an architect as any kind of consistent figure. Architect is work, it's labor, it's a way of working. So yeah, my answer would be depends on the architect. Certainly not me. Yeah.
Should we take one last question?
Not in the way of anybody else. Students, definitely.
From the latest RIBA election, you mentioned it in such a positive light. Is it realistic to expect any positive change in the near future, or is the system so far gone that it's unlikely?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in terms of the leverage that Moira has, he is still one vote in council, and he does get to kind of like set out presidential priorities and things like this, and obviously he does have a lot of soft power as well as the kind of figurehead of the institution. But my honest answer is I expect some advances on things that the profession is already more agreeable with, namely climate. Like, I think what he said so far about climate action, retrofit, he had some like, basically a condemnation of the abandonment of net zero policies from the Conservatives, and I personally don't think I've ever seen any kind of confrontational language from a RIBA president against an incumbent government before, so I'm sort of optimistic on that front. When it comes to like labour unions, I personally don't think Moira's going to be the one to make big strides on that, but I am optimistic about how, with the Just Transition lobby, we're starting to build a kind of bigger umbrella of kind of shared values and vision that people can organise under. We have a union member on the council now, at least one, and I'm optimistic that we'll get there through a continued sort of effort of this sort of campaign, but I don't know if I would put all of it on Moira personally.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really great, and I think that the the level of understanding in how the context that we sit within is something that's incredibly important. But I think the level of self-education that it takes to kind of get to that point of understanding takes an incredible amount of time commitment, which I think is frustrating that it's not in our mainstream education, and that's information that you often have to access on your own. But I was just wondering if there were texts, books that you felt were particularly important in ways that you think, well, the world that we live in, and that has resulted in being able to articulate the kind of these ideas.
I mean, I think for me it was a process of kind of pulling on a thread and seeing where it took us, because we started being angry about overtime, and then from that we heard, oh, we have to do overtime because our fees are so low. From that, oh, our fees are so low because of competition over the last sort of 40 years. Competition was so bad over the last 40 years because of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, the sort of band-aid and more recent evolution of capitalism. Capitalism, a fundamentally extractive mode of production, which, you know, not to sound like a generic student activist, but you can trace most problems back to, like, that's just the truth of it. And with each of this kind of like level of pulling that thread, each one comes with a set of like literature, books, interviews, podcasts, whatever, that help you understand that, not just from that one thread that you're following, but from a much broader political and economic picture. So for me, a really great place to start was critical architecture writing, like the Failed Architecture Platform, New York Review of Architecture is very good. After Party is very good, and probably many others I'm forgetting. Then, you know, kind of maybe reading, if you want to get the ambition up from that, reading some Doug Spencer, the Architecture of Neoliberalism I showed earlier is really good. And then I think at that point it's useful to then bring it outside of architecture. If you want to go all the way, like I did, and it took a very long time, read Capital. Like you really can't quite get a proper framework of understanding, in my opinion, as nuanced as that one in terms of understanding how capital functions. And also just like read history, learn history, because a lot of these lessons are embodied in history as well. They're embodied in, you know, the relationship, the development of the British Empire and the and then of the American Empire, and how it relates to sort of alternative economic structures, like how it relates to Cuba and things like this. Like there's you can sort of learn a lot of embodied knowledge, I think, through reading history too. So for me, that was many lanes of inquiry, and a very good podcast as well by some friends of ours is Street Sweeper podcast, which also definitely recommend. And if you want a I've been meaning for at least a year to do a FAF reading list, and I will do it. I will do it this time. I will make a FAF reading list, and so keep an eye out for that as well, because I've wanted to put that together for a very long time now.
Charlie, I'd like to just make a point that I think one thing in addition is we young people should all do is engage in politics on a local level and a national level, much more than we do. We are, I wouldn't say apathetic, but we are passive on the subject. And I think this is really a big problem. We will probably have a leg on within a year. I don't say it's great, and I listen to them, but it is a whole lot better than what we've had for the last 13 years. And I would say we should try to embrace them, help them, and show them the way. This is really the problem, because I do think that, you know, I run a practice, and it is extremely difficult. And I think what you're talking about has a danger of nibbling at the edges, but not really. The story you told of the traces, the threads, it's true. It's like that. So, you know, we try not to work on weekend, try not to work on evening. We're all within a broader condition that we need to change. And I think engaging in politics on a bigger level, I would say to all young people, get involved. Stand for your local council. Stand as an MP. Don't forget. do something like that. That's what will make a difference. And I think I'm always an optimist, but I think there is some change coming that I hope for.
Yeah, I think the really important context for that is the climate piece, right? Because for someone in this room to run as an MP, you're talking of something that is a process of a magnitude of 5, 10 sort of years, and though that is the time that the action needs to take place, or the action needs to take place yesterday, but in terms of what we are looking forward to, the action needs to take place within that time. So my view of party politics is actually quite similar to my view of how we've engaged with previous REPA presidents, which is getting them to be the source of the change is unlikely, but changing the conditions that they have to work within is much more achievable. And with the big shifts that I mentioned, achieving the weekend, achieving the 8-hour work week, women getting the right to vote, all of these things, none of these came from central motivation of central government. These all came from organizers outside of government, or maybe at lower levels of government, who shifted what was politically expedient. If you look at the Netherlands right now, the Netherlands have just begun the process of committing to phase out oil and gas, not because there were good people in parliament, but because people sat on a main road for 28 days while getting blasted by water cannons. So from my point of view and from my experience, yes, we do absolutely need people engaging directly with the mechanisms of power, but that alone, I think, is going to take too long. I think what we need is we also need people all around the mechanisms of power changing the tenor of what must happen as well. And I think that is also a lesson that history tells us of. That is how a lot of these major changes happen. So I think it's not an either or, I think it's a yes and. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That was
you.
really insightful.